Who made God? Family in our church shared a song with us that starts with that exact question, who made God? And then it goes through and the song answers the fact that no one made God. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we are continuing to answer the question, who is God? We're looking at essentially the doctrine of God. We have seen that God is spirit. We've looked at the qualities of that spirit, that is invisible, and yet he describes himself with some human terms to communicate some of his abilities. And we come here to John 4 just as a jumping off point to remind us that God is spirit. That's his essence. In the same way that our essence is a spirit, a soul, and a body, God is spirit. But who made God's spirit? Well, nobody made God's spirit, and we've sort of demonstrated this already from Scripture. Isaiah indicates that there was no other gods other than God, and therefore God would have to be his own cause, because nobody could have fathered God or created God, and none of that would make any sense. It wouldn't make any sense then to say that God self-created. And so we come over to John chapter 1, a very important statement. Now, John 1, what he's doing is actually introducing the person of God the Son, but he introduces him as the Word, because in the Old Testament, this is who he was. He was the Word that continued to show up and speak to people. The Word of the Lord came to and said. The Word of the Lord came to and said. And it's not a message that was coming to him. There was a person of the Godhead who was coming to him and giving him revelation. He was the one that in Genesis chapter 1 was saying, let us do this, or saying, let there be light. So this is God the Son, is the way we frequently refer to him. And it says, in the beginning was the Word, or in a beginning was the Word. And it says, and the Word was facing God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Verse 3, all things, it says here in verse 3, came to be. All things came to be through him. That is, he was the agency in this case. And apart from him, without him doing this then, nothing came into being that has come into being. He doesn't use the word create here. He chooses to use here the word come into being, and he uses it 1, 2, 3 times in the Greek. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And I really like the way the New American Standard represents that, because it really gives the idea, if there's something that had a point in time that it began, if there's something that came into being, it didn't exist and then it did exist, everything, whatever it is like that, came into being through him. Specifically talking about God the Son here. And it says, and in fact, nothing came into being that has come into being. Now, if he's created, if God the Son is created, or if God is created in general, then the problem with this is, well, then he came into being in a point in time. There was a point in time in which he began to exist, and this would all be turned on its ear and would be a lie, because in reality, he couldn't cause himself, is what we're trying to say. And that just doesn't make any sense to say that he caused himself. Similarly, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, we read, referring to Jesus Christ in particular, again, he is the image of the invisible God. We saw this in a previous study, that it says that God's invisible. This is he can make himself appear, but it is not his nature to have a form or a body or something visible that we can see with our eyes. And it says he is then the firstborn of all creation, which doesn't mean he's the first created thing. No, that firstborn is, if you were speaking in their culture and you said firstborn, they would think, oh, you're heir. That's your heir. So he's the heir of all things. And we have other scriptures that say exactly that. He is the heir of all things. And then it says, for by him. Now we switch over to this Greek preposition en. It's used as in an instrumental sense. By him, all things were created, both the things in the heavens and the things on the earth. The things that are visible, usually we can relate to the visible things out there, the trees, the rocks. We look at that and we say, oh, that's visible, but also the invisible things. And he mentions the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. These are types of angels. we popularly call them angels, but they know themselves as thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities. And so he's created visible things, but he's also created invisible things. He's created these beings that we call spirits, or popularly we call them angels. They know themselves as thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities. And he says, and all things, notice this again, all things have been created through him. And then the last part of this, let me move the Greek up here if it doesn't want to move for some reason. My thing got stuck there. There it is. All things are created through him. There's our word through, dia, and ice, and our Bibles translate it for him. I would even say, we could even take this in a causative sense, in view of him or because of him. In view of him could give a for sense, but it can also give a because of him. So everything that was created. And both of these, by the way, are laying emphasis on God the Son. So both of these have also demonstrated that God the Son is God, and that God the Son is creator of all things, meaning that God the Son is not created. He doesn't owe his existence to God the Father. But it also, and this is very important to understand, is it's demonstrating that, see, God is a creator. And so if we went back to Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth, or Isaiah 42:5. Thus says God, the Lord who created the heavens, stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. In other words, he's looking at how he has created and gives life. And this is attributed here to God, and then this word Lord, all in capital letters, referring to the title over here, Jehovah, or Jehovah, and the one who is. If you remember that from the other day when God says, I am who I am, well, when we say it, then we would say the one who is, the one who exists. That's the idea of God. He's the uncreated. He's the uncreated creator. It's very important for us to understand God exists of himself. Nobody made him. There's a fancy word, if you want to learn fancy words, the word is deity. The deity coming from Latin, meaning that he's self-existent. He's his own cause. He is uncaused. Nothing caused him outside of himself. And that's the fancy word that you learn when you take theology. But it's just, I think, enough for us to understand God's always been. God does not owe his existence to anybody. God is, it's the best way to describe God. God is self-existent. It's not a bad way to look at him. God was not created, was not formed. God has always been. And that's a very important thing for us to understand, because if we understand that God doesn't owe his existence to anybody, then that means he doesn't have to answer to anybody outside of himself. See, I'm the result of parents, and so a certain degree I answer to my parents, and I'm also then procreated as part of this creation that God started thousands of years ago, and therefore I also owe something to God. But because God is uncreated, because God wasn't in that position, God doesn't owe anybody anything. He doesn't have to answer to anybody. The only time he owes somebody something is if he's made a promise, that he's promised that he'll do a thing. But he has nobody above him in any sense that he ever has to answer to. Never has, never will. And this is very important for us to understand, because that means that every promise that he's made to us, everything he does, is backed up by his very nature. By the very fact that he's not going to be interrupted by somebody that goes, oh, wait a second, I told you had to do this. Oh, I forgot about that. I kind of get caught up in no, he's not like that, because he's uncreated. In fact, he is the creator of all things that ever had a point in time that it came into existence. This is our God. And I trust that encourages you today, gives you something to worship about. I hope you're taking these little pieces and thinking, this is something for me to think about and appreciate and talk to God about and worship him, because this is what real worship is thinking about God and his character. And it's a privilege that we've been given. And with that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord, and I thank you for joining me.